Well, I bring you greetings from the University of Michigan. And I am honored to be here in Heidelberg. In fact, I was here in Heidelberg once before, a long time ago, in 1952, 54 years ago. That was my Wanderjahr. It was a wonderful time, I remember it, and I'm very pleased to come back. And I have been greeted very graciously by Rainier and Alexandra and Catherine and others, and I appreciate it. I hope when you come to the United States and you come to Ann Arbor, Michigan, as I hope you will, that you also will be treated graciously and with the same hospitality that I have received here. Now, at the University of Michigan, I am, as Rainier said, a professor of philosophy, and I have served for many parts of the university, including the medical school, where you will understand, of course, the moral status of animals is of very great interest. And I have written at length about the matter. Rainier mentioned the book, The Animal Rights Debate, which Tom Reagan and I wrote, point, counterpoint. He and I are friends, though we disagree sharply on the substance of this matter. I brought along a copy, but I noticed anyway there are copies out in the back for people to read if they like. So the central question then is really, do animals have rights? That's the threshold question. And with your permission, I'm going to be talking about this for about an hour. And I'll ask you to hold your comments and your questions until then, and then we can have a discussion. But I must begin with an apology. Auf Deutsch kann ich ein wenig sagen. Aber nicht viel und nicht genug. Mein Deutsch ist wahrlich ganz schrecklich. Und so, entschuldigen Sie mich, aber wir müssen weitermachen in English. You understand? In English, I must proceed. My lecture will be in 3 parts. Part 1, if animals had rights. Now, of course, whenever I use the word animals, I mean non-human animals. We are animals too, plainly. If animals had rights. And 2, why animals do not have rights. And 3, why animals are mistakenly believed to have rights. And that is a lot to talk about, so you must be patient and make yourself comfortable. Part 1, if animals had rights. Well, do they? I mean, the answer to the question whether animals have rights is very important, because if animals do have rights, those rights must be respected, even at the cost of great burdens for human beings. A right is a claim which is valid, or a potential claim, made by one moral agent under principles that govern both the person who claims the right and the target of the claim. So rights are precious, and they overwhelm mere interests. In our moral lives, rights are central. And we need to think for just a minute about what a right is like. You have a right to the return of money which you lent me, let us say. It may be in my interest to keep the money. You may not need the money, but my interests and my convenience and your convenience are not to the point. You have a right to the money. We establish courts of law partly to ensure that such rights will be respected. And even when there is no law, I may have a right. If you give me a promise, I have a right to its moral fulfillment by you. It may be very much in your interest to break that promise, but your interests and the absence of the law are not critical. When your promise was given and we both understood it, you and I have a moral relationship. I have a right. Similarly, governments in power may have great interests, even benevolent interests, in denying my rights to travel or my right to speak freely, but their interests are overridden by my rights. Rights override interests. In medical investigations, we could learn a great deal about some new drug or procedure by trying it experimentally on human subjects. Perhaps the drug is of a kind that is known to be dangerous. Perhaps the procedure has never been tried before. We could deceive the subjects that we use in those studies, or we might even use force to compel involuntary participation. Perhaps the trials would be painful or injurious. Suppose they are. And suppose that from those trials we could learn a great deal. Perhaps that procedure is futile or that drug is wonderful. Even so, we know that in a civilized community, medical science may not be advanced in that way. Why not? Because the human subjects of medical experiments have rights that demand respect. And when these rights are ignored and the subjects are deceived or used against their will, we would certainly agree that such experiments are grossly immoral. Even if the investigators' motives were good, the studies are wrong, morally wrong, if they use human beings in ways that fail to respect their rights. Now, as you know, some persons believe that using animals in medical experiments is morally wrong in the same way that using human subjects against their will is wrong. Humans have the right not to be used in that fashion. If animals have rights, I underscore the if animals have rights, they have the right not to be used in that fashion. The reasoning here is plausible. Such persons do honestly believe that animals have rights, and if animals have rights, they have the right not to be killed simply to advance our interests. The issue is not whether our motives are good or whether our interests are important. Medical science is important and all that. But interests yield to rights, and if they have rights, those rights must be respected. Now, some people may say, well, they have rights, but we have rights too, and our rights override their rights. That may be true in some cases, but it won't solve the problem, because although we may have a weighty interest in learning, say, how to vaccinate against polio or other diseases, we don't have a right to learn those things, nor could we honestly claim that we kill the mice that we use in research in self-defense. They did not attack us. If animals have rights, they have the right not to be killed to advance the interests of others, whatever interests those others may have. In 1952, the same year I came to Heidelberg, there were about 58,000 cases of polio reported in the United States, and about 3,000 polio deaths. My parents everywhere in the country, trembled in fear for their children at summer camp or away from home. But in 1955, 3 years later, polio vaccination became routine. The number of cases in the United States dropped very quickly to about 12 a year. And today, polio has been completely eradicated from the Western Hemisphere, not completely from the Eastern. Now, the vaccine that achieved this wonderful result, I trust you will agree it is a wonderful result, that vaccine was developed and tested a few hundred meters from where I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It could have been developed only with the substantial use of animal subjects. See, polio vaccines had been tried many times before, but they were very dangerous. In fact, the children who received the vaccines often contracted the disease instead of being protected by it. So investigators were very, very cautious about the use of would-be polio vaccines. Now, today, the killer disease for which a vaccine is needed most seriously is not AIDS, but malaria. Malaria kills, we think, about 2 million people every year. 2 million. And leaves many others very sick. Most of them, of course, are children. Most of them are in Africa. Many vaccines have been tried to stop malaria. None have succeeded yet. Not on children. We don't try these vaccines, of course. But recently, very recently, after years of effort, we have learned, medical science, I say we, not that, medical science has learned how to make a vaccine that does inoculate successfully, completely, against malaria for mice. For mice. A safe vaccine for humans we do not yet have, but someday soon we will have it. Thanks to the use of those mice, many of whom will have died in that process. To test that vaccine first on children would be an outrage. Whose children? Yours? Mine? As it would have been an outrage to test the so-called Sabin polio vaccine on children. We use mice or monkeys or dogs because there is no other way. And there never will be another way because untested vaccines are very dangerous. And their first use on a living organism is inescapably experimental, and there will be no way to determine the reliability or the safety of new vaccines without repeated tests on live organisms. Therefore, since I hope you will agree that we may not use children, your children or my children, to test these vaccines, we will use mice. Or as we develop a vaccine for AIDS, perhaps we will use primates. Or we will have no such vaccines. None. But if those animals that we use in such tests have rights, as human beings have rights, then what we do to those mice and are doing to them is as wrong as it would be to test vaccines on innocent captured children. Now, defenders of animal rights do not necessarily think that medical scientists are vicious, but they will say, their reasoning obliges them to conclude, that what medical investigators are doing today with mice and rats and rabbits is morally impermissible. Wrong. Most biomedical investigations involving animal subjects use rodents, of course, mice and rats. The rat is the animal appropriately considered and often used by the critic as the exemplar whose moral stature is in dispute here. Tom Reagan, with whom I wrote this book and who lectured here in this series in May, you may have been here, Tom Reagan is a leading defender of the view that rats have rights. And he agrees with me that rights override interests, and so he is an honest man, and therefore he sees the consequences of his view. And the consequences of his view he accepts forthrightly. The harms that others, ourselves, may face as a result of the cessation of some practice is no defense for allowing it to continue, he writes. No one has a right to be protected against being harmed if the protection involves violating the rights of others. No one has the right to be protected by an unjust practice, one that violates the rights of others. No justice, which involves the protection of rights, for animals too, if animals have rights. Justice must be done, though the heavens fall. You know the line. It echoes Kant, who borrowed in turn from an older tradition. Fiat justitiae et pereat mundus. Let justice be done if the world perishes. Believing that rats have rights, as humans do, Tom Reagan and others, perhaps some of you, are convinced that killing them in medical research is morally intolerable. Reagan writes, I use him as an example of the animal rights view. In his book is The Case for Animal Rights. He is the leading representative of the animal rights position. He writes, we cannot, we cannot justify harming a single rat by aggregating the many human and humane benefits that flow from doing it. Not even a single rat is to be treated as if that animal's value were reducible to utility relative to the interests of others. So his position is very clear. I mean, we may not do what we're doing in medical science. We just simply may not do it, not morally. If there are some things we cannot learn as a consequence of that, if we can get no vaccinations, or we can get no vaccines, or we can get no... That's tough. That's tough, as he puts it. So be it. Now, this is the conclusion to which one is driven if you hold that animals have rights. You have to see that that is what you are involved in. You have to conclude that medical investigations involving rats and mice must stop. Because it can never be right to kill them, unless perhaps they are attacking us. I mean, sometimes a rat may attack a baby, and then we would have a right to kill it in self-defense, perhaps. But medical investigations cannot be described as self-defense. Come on. And medical investigations commonly do require that many mice and rats be killed. I am involved in the evaluation of medical investigations at the University of Michigan and the medical school. I have been for many years, and I will tell you that the number of rats and mice that we use is very great, and that virtually every important study uses some animals or other, and that whenever we confront a study involving human beings, the first question that will be asked is, where are the animal data? What do we know about animals before we use it on humans? Right? Can we simply, well then, surely, can we not replace animals with something else? Replacement, you know, has been a theme of many, but we cannot. The replacement of animal subjects by computer simulations, by tissue samples, by microbiological analysis, it's a fantasy, a phantasm, because a new drug or a new procedure has got to be tried sooner or later on a living organism. And that trial will be crucial and will be a crucial experiment. If animals have rights, biomedical investigations using animal subjects will have to stop. Now, this extraordinary consequence, I think, is an extraordinary consequence. I mean, I have been a member of the medical school faculty. I mean, if you tell my colleagues in the medical school faculty we no more uses of animals, I mean, the school will practically close down. So I think it's an extraordinary consequence. This extraordinary consequence doesn't bother Tom Reagan very much at all. Because, you know, he's not a consequentialist. He doesn't decide whether things are right or wrong as a result of their consequences. He's not a utilitarian. For him, the interests of humans, the desire to be freed of disease, to be relieved of pain, simply cannot outweigh the rights of one rat, because rights override interests. The issue is one of justice for him, and the use of animals in medical experimentation is not just. Now, I think that the consequences of this view are horrendous. Incredibly damaging to the well-being of humankind. I would hope that you would agree with me in that. Would you support the work? That is, well, consider what that work on polio back in the 1950s. Would you support it? Do you think that it was a good thing to eliminate polio from the Western Hemisphere and from most of the Eastern Hemisphere? Would you support work just like it? Saving tens of thousands of human children from diphtheria or hepatitis or measles or rabies or rubella or tetanus, all of which require the use of animals. Would you support work that is being done now to stop the pandemic of AIDS and even more malaria? Now look, I support that work with all my heart. If you would join me in this support, if you believe that this work is humane and important, then you must conclude that the defense of the rights or alleged rights of animals is a great mistake and a very dangerous one. That concludes part one. I next aim to explain why animals cannot possess rights. Up to this point, I've only been talking about what happens if they possess rights. So part two, why animals do not have rights. There are many obligations owed by human beings to animals. I think none of us will deny that. But it doesn't follow from this that animals have rights, because it is not true that every obligation that we have arises from the rights of another. Not at all. And we need to be clear and we need to be very careful here. This is important territory. Rights entail obligations. If you have a right to the return of the money that I borrowed, then I have an obligation to repay the money. No issue. If we have the right to speak freely on public policy, then the community has the obligation to respect that right. But the proposition all rights entail obligations does not, as the logicians say, convert simply. From the true proposition that all trees are plants, we certainly may not conclude that all plants are trees. We simply cannot convert a universal proposition of that sort simply. So some obligations, like mine to repay the money that I borrowed from you, do arise out of rights. But many obligations are owed to persons or to other beings who have no rights whatever in the matter. Obligations come from many sources. Obligations may arise from commitments that we freely make. As a college professor, I accept the obligation to comment at length on the papers that my students write for me every week. And I do that. But they do not have the right to demand that I do it. They have no right to that comment. Civil servants and elected officials ought to be courteous to members of the public. That is, I think, an obligation of theirs, but it is not grounded in the rights of a citizen. I don't have a right that they should be courteous to me. Special relations give rise to obligations. Hosts have the obligation to be cordial to their guests. But the guest does not have the right to demand cordiality. Shepherds have obligations to their dogs, and cowboys have obligations to their horses, which do not flow from the rights of those dogs or horses. My son, who is now 14, waiting for me up north in Floto, may someday wish to study veterinary medicine, as my father did. And if he does, I will have the obligation to help him as I can, and I will, with pride, of course, do so. But he does not have the authority to demand such help as a matter of right. My dog, and I have 2 dogs as a matter of fact, have rights to exercise and veterinary care, have no right to daily exercise and veterinary care, but I do have the obligation to provide those things for them. One may be obliged to another for a special act of kindness that has been done. One may be obliged to put an animal out of its misery in view of its condition, but neither the beneficiary of the kindness nor that dying animal may have had a claim of right. Now, some of our most important obligations to members of our family, to the needy, to neighbors, to sentient creatures of every sort have no foundation in rights. The relationship between rights and obligations appears critical from the perspective of one who holds the right. Your right correlates with my obligation to respect it. But the claim that rights and obligations are reciprocals and that every obligation flows from another's right is false. Plainly inconsistent with our general understanding of the differences between what we think we ought to do and what others can justly demand that we do. Now, I emphasize this very strongly because although animals do not have rights, in my view, it surely does not follow from this that one is free to treat them with disregard or with callous inhumanity. Not at all. Animals are not stones. They feel. A rat may suffer. Surely we have the obligation not to torture it gratuitously. Even if the concept of a right does not apply to it, or could not apply to it, we humans are obliged to act humanely. That is, being aware of their sentience, their capacity to feel, we are obliged to apply to animals the moral principles that govern us regarding the gratuitous imposition of pain and suffering, which is not, of course, to treat animals as though they possessed rights. Animals cannot be the bearers of rights because the concept of a right is essentially human. It is rooted in, and it has force within, a human moral world. Humans must deal with rats, all too frequently in some contexts, and humans must be moral in their dealing with them. But a rat can no more be said to have rights than a table can be said to be ambitious or have ambition. To say of a rat that has rights is to confuse categories. It is to apply to its world a moral category that has content only in the human moral world. Try this thought experiment. Imagine you are on the Serengeti Plain in East Africa. And on that plain, a lioness is hunting for her cubs. A baby zebra, momentarily left unattended by its mother, is the prey. The lioness snatches the baby zebra, rips open its throat, tears out chunks of its flesh for its cubs, and departs. The mother zebra is driven nearly out of her wits when she cannot find her baby, and then when she finds it, she will stay with it sometimes for days, the carcass for days. The scene is unpleasant, I know, but it is entirely natural and extremely common. If the zebra has the right to live, if the prey is just but the predator is unjust, well, then we ought to intervene, if we can, on behalf of the right. But we do not intervene, of course. As we would intervene if we saw the lioness about to attack a human baby, or you. Now, what accounts for the moral difference between the baby zebra and the human baby? We justify different responses to humans and to zebras on the ground, implicit or explicit, that their moral status is very different. The human has a right not to eat alive. It is, after all, a human being. Do you believe that the zebra has the right not to be slaughtered by that lioness? Do you believe that the lioness has the right to kill that baby zebra for its cubs? Well, if when you are confronted with this set of questions, you are inclined to say, confronted by such natural rapacity, by the way, it is natural rapacity which is duplicated on the planet Earth millions of times every day, especially in the oceans. If you are inclined to say, well, but neither is right or wrong, neither one has a right against the other, you may want to say, then I am on your side. That's so. Rights are of the highest moral consequence, yes, but zebras and lions and rats are totally amoral. There is no morality for them. They do no wrong, ever. In their world, there are no rights. One contemporary philosopher who has thought a good deal about this refers to animals as moral patients and says, a moral patient, the animal, lacks the ability to formulate, let alone to bring to bear, principles in deliberating about which one of among a number of possible acts it will be right or proper to perform. Moral patients, animals, in a word, cannot do what is right, nor can they do what is wrong. Even when a moral patient causes harm to another, the moral patient has not done what is wrong. Only moral agents can do what is wrong. Right, correct. Just so. The concepts of wrong and right are totally foreign to animals, not conceivably within their ken or applicable to them. As the author of that passage agrees, the author of that passage is Tom Reagan. So, when animals are used in our research, therefore, we certainly ought to be humane. But we cannot violate the rights of those animals because, to be blunt, they don't have any rights. Rights do not apply to them, but humans do have rights. So where do our rights come from? Why are we not crudely natural creatures like the rats and the zebras? Now, this is a very, very difficult question, you understand. It is a question that philosophers have been struggling to answer for thousands of years. And a definitive account of the human moral condition you cannot expect me to give you in 10 minutes of this lecture. But I would ask you to think with me for a few minutes about the different kinds of answers that are given to this question. Kinds of answers. Some believe that our moral understanding with its duties is a gift of God. St. Thomas said that. The moral law is binding, and humans have the power given by God to grasp its binding character, and must therefore respect the rights that other humans possess. God makes us, as St. Augustine said before him, in his own image, and therefore with a will that is free, and gives us the power to recognize that, and therefore, unlike the other creatures, we must choose between good and evil, between right and wrong. Well, as you know, many philosophers are very skeptical of such theological justifications of rights and duties, and many have sought the ground of human morality in a different sphere, in membership by all humans in some kind of moral community. The English idealist Bradley called it an organic moral community. The German idealist Hegel called it an objective ethical order. These and like accounts commonly center upon human interrelations, upon a moral fabric within which human agents must always act, and within which animals never act and never can possibly act. Now, this is very abstract reasoning, and it is so highly abstract that some people find it very unsatisfying. So you may find more nearly true the convictions of those philosophers who call themselves ethical intuitionists and realists, who said, as H.L.A. Pritchard did in Britain, and Sir David Ross in Britain, and my friend and teacher, C.D. Broad, of great fame in the last century, used to say, well, there is a direct, underivative, intuitive cognition of rights possessed by other human beings, but not by animals. We see it, and we see it directly and intuitively. Maybe that doesn't satisfy you. Maybe in the end, you, in your reflections on this matter, will return to Kant, and you will say with him, perhaps, that critical reason reveals at the core of human action a uniquely moral will, and the unique ability to grasp and to lay down moral laws for oneself and for others, an ability that is not conceivably within the capacity of any non-human animal whatever. To be a moral agent on this view is to be able to grasp the generality of moral restrictions upon our will. Humans understand, you and I understand, that some things which may not be in our interest must not be willed. We lay down moral laws for ourselves, and thus we exhibit, as no other animal can exhibit, moral autonomy. My dogs know that there are certain things that they must not do. But they know this only as a result of their learning about their interests and the pains they may suffer if they do what had been taught forbidden. They do not know, they cannot know, as Tom Reagan agrees, that any conduct is wrong. That concept is not within their ken. The proposition, it would be highly advantageous to act in such and such a way, but I may not do so because it would be wrong. That proposition, which you and I may express quite honestly, easily, is one that no dog or no mouse or no rabbit, however sweet or endearing, however loyal or attentive, can ever entertain or intend. Right is not in their world. But right and wrong are the very stuff of human moral life. The ever-present awareness of human beings who can do wrong and who seek, often, not always, to avoid wrong conduct and prove themselves members of a moral community in which rights may be exercised and must be respected. Now, some people respond to this by saying, well, no, this can't be right because, after all, human infants have rights, but they can't make any moral claims or judgments, or the comatose or the senile can't make any claims. So if this view involves their not having rights, it must be absurd. But objections of that kind miss the point. It's not individual persons who qualify or who are disqualified for the possession of rights because they have or they don't have some special capacity, thus resulting in the reward of rights to some but not others. No. Rights are universally human. They arise in a human moral world, in a moral sphere. In the human world, moral judgments are pervasive. And it is the fact that all humans, including infants and the senile, are members of that moral community. Not the fact that as individuals they have or do not have certain special capacities that makes humans the bearers of rights. It is therefore beside the point to insist that animals have remarkable capacities, as some friends of animals do, that they really have a consciousness of self, or of the future, or that they make plans, and so on. And the tired response, because infants plainly cannot make moral claims, they must have no rights at all, or rats must have them too, that we should put aside forever. Responses like these arise out of a misconception of right. They mistakenly suppose that rights are tied to some identifiable individual ability or sensibilities, and they fail to see that rights arise only in a community of moral beings, and that therefore there are spheres in which rights do apply and spheres in which they do not. Rationality is not at issue. The capacity to communicate is not at issue. My dog can reason, weakly perhaps, but she can, and she can communicate. Nor is the capacity to suffer at issue. And if autonomy be understood only as the capacity to choose this course rather than that, then autonomy is not to the point either. But moral autonomy, that is, moral self-legislation, is to the point, because moral autonomy is uniquely human and is for animals out of the question, as we have seen, and as Reagan and I agree. In talking about autonomy, therefore, we must be very careful and precise. Now, because humans do have rights, and these rights can be violated by other humans, we say that some humans commit crimes. But whether a crime has been committed depends entirely upon the moral state of mind of the actor. If I take your coat or your book, honestly thinking that it was my coat or my book, I don't steal it. That's not stealing. The actus reus, the guilty deed, must be accompanied by in a genuine crime by a guilty mind, a mens rea, as we say. That recognition, not just of possible punishment for an act, but also of moral duty that governs us in a moral world, no rat, no cow can possess. In primitive times, humans did sometimes bring cows and horses to the bar of human justice, and now we laugh at that. We realize that accusing cows of crimes marks the primitive moral view as inane. Animals cannot be criminals because they have no moral state of mind. Mistakes parallel to this in other spheres, non-moral spheres, may be helpful for us to think about for a moment or two. In the third part of the Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant explains with great care the blunders, the metaphysical blunders into which we are led when we misapply concepts of great human import. For example, in our human experience, as he explains, the concepts of time and space, the relations of cause and effect, of subject and attribute, and others are absolutely essential, fundamental. But forgetting that these are concepts which arise only within the realm of human experience, we are sometimes misled into asking, Kant points out, was the world caused or is it uncaused? Did the world have a beginning in time or did it not? And Kant explains in one of the most brilliant long passages in all philosophical literature why it makes no sense to ask such questions. Cause applies to phenomena that we humans encounter in the world. It is a category of our experience and cannot apply to the world as a whole. Time is the condition of our experience, not an absolute container in which the world could have begun. The antinomies of pure reason, and after these the paralogisms of pure reason, Kant patiently exhibits as confusions arising from the misapplication of the categories of experience. His lesson is powerful and deep. The misapplication of concepts leads to error and sometimes to nonsense. And so it is also with rights. To say that rats have rights is to apply to the world of rats a concept that makes good sense when applied to humans, but makes no sense at all when applied to rats. That concludes part 2. Part 3 is relatively short, so bear with me, and I will conclude with it. Why animals, part 3, are mistakenly believed to have rights. How does it happen that thinkers go so often astray in this sphere? If rats cannot be the holders of rights, then the advocates of animal rights, like Tom Reagan, have gotten off the track. Well, how did they get off the track? Well, the mistake arises, I suggest, when we carry over what is claimed about human rights to rats and other animals. But why would we do that? Well, the reason is that moral patients of animals are seen to have inherent value. And moral agents, like ourselves, also possess inherent value. And so the key to the argument which leads to that result is this tricky concept of inherent value. And how that concept gets used becomes absolutely critical. And the problem is one of equivocation. Inherent value is an expression used by many thinkers with two very different senses. In one sense, it is reasonable to conclude that those who have inherent value have rights. And in the other sense, that same inference is not warranted. But the phrase inherent value is quite plausible, intelligible in both contexts. And thus, by sliding from one sense of inherent value to the other sense of that phrase, one is led to conclude that moral patients, the animals, have the same moral stature as the moral agents, but they do not. This concept of inherent value is really important. Human beings are equal in a deep sense because they are humans. Every human being counts because he or she has inherent value. So we are all of us equal in being moral agents who possess inherent value. And this approach to the moral stature of humans you are likely to find very plausible. One may call it the postulate of inherent value. All humans, even the lonely and the forsaken and the unwanted and so forth, are inherently valuable. We grasp that point. All genuine moral agents are equal in inherent value. And this is not new. I mean, it's in Locke, it's in Rousseau, it's in Spinoza, it's in Kant. And with Kant, we are likely to say that humans are beyond price. Their inherent value gives them moral dignity, gives them a unique role in the moral world because they are agents having rational wills and the capacity to make moral judgments and to act morally. And that is inherent value. Call it inherent value in sense one. But the expression inherent value has another sense. And this other sense, sense two, is also common. And it is also very plausible. My dog has inherent value. He cannot be replaced by any other dog. The great trees of the California forests, 1,000 years old and 100 meters high, they have inherent value. And so also does every wild animal and every baby seal and every monkey and every fox. And that is why we grasp intuitively the truth that the senseless killing of animals is the senseless killing of animals is often repugnant. Every animal is unique, not replaceable in itself by another animal, or by any rocks, or by clay. So animals, like humans, are not just things, they live. And as unique living creatures, they have inherent value. This is a very important claim. And again, you are likely to agree that it is not only plausible, but true. However, here, in this sense, sense two, the phrase inherent value means something quite different from what was meant in its earlier use. Inherent value in sense one, that Kantian dignity possessed by all humans but not by animals, which warrants the moral role of humans and their rights, is very different from inherent value in sense two, which warrants no such claim. The uniqueness of their animals, their intrinsic worthiness as individual living things, does not ground the possession of rights. It has nothing to do with the moral condition in which rights arise. But it is very easy and tempting to confuse these two concepts. And then, if one has argued plausibly that beings with inherent value, sense one, have rights that must be respected, then one could mistakenly conclude that rats and rabbits must also have rights because they too have inherent value, and they do, but their inherent value is a different matter entirely. It's inherent value in sense two. And we confront here an egregious example of the fallacy of equivocation. An informal fallacy, common enough, in which two or more meanings of the same word or phrase have been confused in the several premises of an argument. The mistake, when you think about it, is almost obvious. So why is this slippage not recognized? Well, it's hard to say, partly because we know that the phrase inherent value is often used loosely, and so you hear it in one sense, you hear it in the other, you're not inclined to quibble about its use. Partly it slips in because both uses of the phrase are common and neither signals danger. Partly it is because inherent value in sense two is indeed shared by those who possess it in sense one. But perhaps the chief reason that the equivocation between these uses is obscured is the fact that the assertion that animals have rights arises only indirectly because it arises from the assumption that moral patients, which have inherent value in sense two, are entitled to the same respect as moral agents, which have inherent value in sense two and in sense one, and that assumption is plausible but unsound. So I invite you to reflect upon this exceedingly common error. Recall the Kantian case. He showed that the very ordinary supposition that if everything in our experience has a cause, and must have a cause, it seems entirely plausible, and yet it is profoundly mistaken to ask whether the world as a whole is caused. We almost need to fight against the temptation to ask that question. Likewise, one must not infer that because animals do have inherent value in one sense, that they have the rights that would follow from the possession of inherent value in the other sense. And that temptation also we must resist. In sum, there is no argument or set of arguments that can make the case for animal rights. Indeed, there could not be. We could no more establish the rights of rats than we could establish the emotional experience of oak trees or the criminality of snakes. Animals do not have rights. Right, I say again, does not apply in their world. We have many obligations to animals, of course, and we honor those, to call attention to those obligations. And I personally give honor to the seriousness of purpose on the part of those like Tom who defend this view and the generous spirit in which animals are defended by them. We are right to act with great sensitivity in the interests of animals whose pain and distress is often very real. We are wrong to ground that concern in the claim that animals have rights. I conclude with a brief historical observation which does not serve as proof, but which is worthy, again, of your reflection. If the mistaken conviction that animals have rights had been long accepted, most successful medical therapies recently devised, most antibiotics, almost all vaccines, all prosthetic devices, and other compounds and instruments upon which we now rely for saving and improving human lives and for the protection of our children, yours and mine, all of that could not have been developed. And for the future, if the view that animals have rights were now to become general